Welcome back to the channel, Daisy Cakes. This is another part in my list of the top 100 science fiction authors. Yes, I've gone through and curated a list of 100 of my favorite science fiction authors and releasing them in alphabetical orders in groups of 10. Why? Because I am Daisy X Machina, the drag queen detective who investigates all things speculative in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. If you haven't seen the first video, it's linked up here. But this video is the second video, and we're picking up with the bees. And the first author is why I'm dressed up in my Star Trek uniform, because it is James Blish. Blish was born in 1921 and began his career in the golden age of science fiction starting in 1940 and was a member of the Futurians, a New York group of progressive science fiction authors that included Isaac Asimov, Damon Knight, Judith Merril, and many others. He won the Hugo in 1959 for his novel A Case of Conscience. I personally recommend Cities in Flight, which is kind of a fix-up novel about space-traveling cities. It started as a 4-volume set, but I think you can get it as 1 volume now. But his claim to fame came from Star Trek, which made Blish a household name, and which he later said accounted for his financial stability. He was commissioned to write the adaptations of Star Trek, the original series. He would base them on early drafts of the scripts, so they were often different and diverged from what was on TV. There was a total of 12 volumes of Star Trek adaptations. He also wrote 1 novel, Spock Must Die. He planned to write more, including one devoted to Harry Mudd, but sadly he passed away in 1975 at the young age of 54. The author I have following James Blish is one you all know would be on this list, Ray Bradbury. Born in 1920, Bradbury had a long, prestigious, and prolific career, and in fact, I did a whole video on Bradbury. If you're interested, I'll link it up here. Bradbury is interesting because he wasn't known for hard science fiction at a time when hard science fiction was considered the epitome of science fiction. Rather, his science fiction was soft, more focused on character development, even bordering on fantasy. In fact, one of my favorite books by Bradbury is Something Wicked This Way Comes, which is pure fantasy. But when it comes to science fiction, he is most known for 2 books, Fahrenheit 451, published in 1953 and serialized in Playboy magazine, about a dystopian future where firemen burn books. However, my favorite of his science fiction, and what I think is his most literary and moving, is The Martian Chronicles, published in 1950, which is a fix-up novel. Fix-up is taking previously published short stories and stitching them together into 1 novel, so it has a very episodic feel to it. And it's about the human colonization of Mars and the tragic confrontation with native Martians. If you haven't read this one, check it out. The next author is one of the best creators of alien races that I've ever read, and that author is David Brinn. Brinn was born in 1950 and came to fame right out of the gate with Sundiver, published in 1980. Its sequel, Startide Rising, published in 1983, won both the Hugo and Nebula. And my favorite in the series, The Uplift Wars, was published in 1987, and that also won the Hugo and was nominated for a Nebula. He wrote more in this series, but the original Uplift novels, the original 3 books or trilogy, is what I think is amazing and which you should really read because they feature some amazing alien races. Alien races are something I really enjoy reading in science fiction. The term uplifting is what is called when you uplift a species from animal to sentience, which all sentient races in the galaxy aspire to do. One of the reasons is when you uplift another race, that race owes their patron race and serves them for some period of time. Humans are kind of small potatoes in this galaxy that Brinn created. Humans are considered weak or not very developed, but they did uplift chimpanzees and dolphins, so they are grudgingly given some respect by the higher alien races. The world building here is some of the best I've ever seen. If you love reading about alien races and how different they can be, if you like your science fiction hard, run, don't walk to Brinn's original Uplift trilogy. The next author came to fame fairly recently, at least for me. His debut novel came crashing out of the gates as a huge phenomenon. Of course, I'm talking about Pierce Brown and his Red Rising series. The first book, Red Rising, was published in 2014. Now, some people erroneously, in my opinion, call Red Rising young adult simply because Darrow, the main character, starts off as a teenager in the first book, and in the first book we also see him in a school with other teenagers. But trust me, especially when you get to later books in the series, with all the sex and ultra-violence, these are adult books. The world Brown has created is set in the far, far future when Earth has developed this society that is genetically stratified based on their role to the society, which are named after color. So if you're born a gray, for example, that means you end up in the police or in security. The bottom of the hierarchy are the reds, who basically are grunt labor because they're able to survive in hostile environments. And at the very top are the golds, the leaders. Red Rising is a story of how Darrow, who is born a red, goes through extensive surgical modification to rise up to be a gold in order to tear the society down. The writing has always amazed me. The society is heavily influenced by ancient Greece, and the writing is so ornate that it feels like it could have been taken from some historical Greek text. It's really an amazing work. There's been rumors of a TV or movie adaptation, which I think would be incredible. Check out Red Rising. I cannot wait to talk about the next author because I was obsessed with him through middle school. That is Edgar Rice Burroughs. Burroughs was born in 1875, and his heyday was in the 20s when a lot of his work was published in primarily the pulp magazines. This was before the golden age of science fiction, but his work has inspired many of the golden age writers: Ray Bradbury, Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov. Many, many others have cited Burroughs as their inspiration. Now, I was reading Burroughs in the 70s, and I had no clue how old these books were. I think I had a vague idea that they're not recently published, but it never really sunk in that it was published in the 20s. Many of the covers I saw that drew me to it was by Frank Frazetta. I read his Venus series and his Moon Maiden series. But I really liked the Pellucidar or At the Earth's Core series. I did not like Tarzan, which is probably what Burroughs is best known for, except I did read Tarzan at the Earth's Core. Anyway, it was sometime in the late 70s when some publisher released these gorgeous jewel-toned editions of John Carter of Mars, and I fell in love. I was obsessed with John Carter. Now, the character John Carter was a Civil War veteran who goes on to travel to Mars and has many adventures, and I always assumed it was historical fiction as we use the term today. But remember, Burroughs was born in 1875. His parents lived through the Civil War. This was not historical for Burroughs. His work is now in the public domain, so you can read it for free on Project Gutenberg or find copies in used bookstores. Now, these are very soft science fiction, sometimes called Sword and Planet or just space adventure or sometimes space opera. If you're looking for eminently readable stories that inspired the science fiction genre, you might want to check out Edgar Rice Burroughs and John Carter of Mars. Frances Marion Busby, or F.M. Busby, was born in 1921, but he was not part of the golden age of science fiction. He got a late start in his career because he didn't start publishing until he was in his 50s. His first novel, Cage a Man, was published in 1973, and that's the novel I recommend. It's the first in a series of novels about the Daimyo. The Daimyo are an alien race of religious zealots who believe they are the image of God and go through the galaxy not just converting other races, but surgically modifying them to look like the Daimyo, who look a bit like lobsters. Cage a Man is about a man, a human, taken by the Daimyo, and it is a pretty dark, brutal book with lots of body horror. But boy, did this one stick with me in my mind. Maybe it'll stick with you too. Now we come to Octavia Butler, another science fiction author I've done a whole video on. She was born in 1947 and has won many awards, including the Hugo and Nebula, and she also won the very prestigious MacArthur Fellowship, also known as the Genius Grant. One of the very few African-American women who are writing science fiction during the 70s and 80s. Her book, Kindred, was published in 1979 and is about a Black woman who time travels to the antebellum South and meets her ancestors. This was the work, I think, that really elevated her name to be recognized outside of just the science fiction community. My favorite novel of hers has always been Wild Seed, published in 1980, about two immortal Africans who are entwined in a very complicated but mostly contentious relationship through the centuries. This is part of the Patternist series, not the first book in the series, but the first book chronologically. And if you only read one Octavia Butler book, that's the one I recommend. But I bet if you read one, you'll want to read more. Why don't more people talk about Jack Chalker? He was one of my favorite authors in the 70s and 80s and was very prolific. He was born in 1944, and his first novel, Midnight at the Well of Souls, was published in 1977. I think I started reading him after his second novel in the series was published, Exile at the Well of Souls, because of the cover. Look at the cover. His most famous novels are probably in the Well of Souls series, which features the Well World, a huge planet-sized scientific laboratory created by a super race that is now extinct. It's made up of hexagonal grids, where each hexagon is a different environment containing a different race. When a group of humans enter the Well World, each of them are transformed into one of these different species. There's a theme of body transformation in a lot of Chalker's works, which is kind of interesting. I also really loved his Four Lords of the Diamond series. I'm not really sure why he's not as well known as some of the other science fiction authors who were his contemporaries, because I think he has a lot of great books out there. If you've been watching this channel, you know that I love Becky Chambers' Monk and Robot books. Chambers was born in 1985, and her first novel, The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, was met with wide acclaim, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet. If you've read it, let me know if I should down in the comments, and while you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Now, what I have read is A Psalm for the Wild Built, published in 2021, which won the Hugo, and A Prayer for the Crowned Shy, published in 2022, which won the Nebula. Both of these are novellas, so short novels, and they are both utopian solar punk novels. Solar punk is, of course, the subgenre of science fiction that imagines a world where technology and nature can live in harmony. And you'd think a utopian society would be boring for a story if there's no conflict, but there is an inner conflict within the non-binary monk Dex, who travels around the small moon of Panga, serving tea to other humans. Dex is searching for meaning in this utopian existence when they meet Moscap, the first sentient AI robot that has been seen in centuries on Panga. These are philosophical stories delving into what it means to be a person and what true relationships really are. It's also kind of an asexual, aromantic love story, one of my favorites of the 21st century. Finally, we'll wrap up this group of science fiction authors with C.J. Cherryh. Born Carolyn Janice Cherryh in 1942, she has been a prolific writer since 1976, and I think she is still publishing today. Many of her works are set in a universe she created called the Alliance Union universe, which spans 27 novels and a bunch of short stories. The Alliance is a confederation of merchants, and the Union is a government that has broken away from Earth. The other very long series she wrote is the Foreigner series, which I believe is now over 20 books. They're broken up into trilogies, and I recommend the first Foreigner trilogy, with Foreigner published in 1994. But my favorite books are the Alliance Union books, and my favorite of those are Citeen, published in 1988, originally as a trilogy, which is how I read it, but now I think it's all under one volume, and it also won the Hugo. Now, I stopped recommending it to people because people I recommended it to that read it told me that it was kind of boring, which surprised me because I loved it, but I get it. It's more of a psychological and political novel than anything else. It's about a famous politician and scientist in the Union, a genius named Ariane Emery, who is murdered. She is then cloned, and the goal is to recreate this clone exactly in her image by raising her as closely as scientists can to the original Ariane, including all the traumas the original Ariane went through. It's a fascinating story, and if you think it might be for you, go ahead and check it out. So this concludes the second volume in my list of the top 100 science fiction authors. Let me know if you disagree with any on the list, or if I've mentioned any that you haven't heard of that you maybe want to read, because after all, that's why we're doing this. Until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.